Congressman and White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel has spent the last 3 years in Japan as U.S. ambassador during President Biden's term, and he has returned stateside to a new reality in America. Donald Trump is back in the White House, and Republicans are in full power across both chambers of Congress, and Democrats are still unsure of what message they need to unify the party. And Rahm Emanuel joins us now. It's great to have you back on the show, Mr. Ambassador. And I'm looking at some comments you made to Financial Times Magazine. You can't be lethargic against this guy. I think everyone is getting their sea legs and trying to figure out how to move forward here, watching these nominations go through, watching Republicans as they respond to Donald Trump's pardons of the January 6th rioters. And what advice would you give moving forward?
Yeah, well, first of all, you're not going to win it just on the first effort. I mean, what I would focus on is the long term, which is not just this first week. And while I would oppose these nominations for a series of reasons, the three issues I would focus on: number one, the Secretary Treasurer in the testimony in front of the Finance Committee said he was against the minimum wage. In the very week in which CEOs are getting pay hikes 30-40%, he's against the minimum wage, and it hasn't been raised in 2 decades. So that, actually 3 decades. So that is where I would go first and foremost and hit. Second, that the Republicans are talking about cutting health care subsidies for middle-class, working-class families to pay for a tax cut for the wealthy. And third, while Donald Trump obviously talked about fighting inflation, a tariff war with Canada, all the energy, not all, but the bulk of the energy, oil and gas for the United States, for the Midwest and the Rocky Mountains, comes from Canada. You're going to see it at the pump immediately. Go right to the economics, go right to the core as issues. I do think, as it relates to a number of these nominations, I would fight them on the, if you want to fight them. I don't think you have to fight every one of them, but where you have clear stands, like I think the idea of the Secretary of Defense, a alcoholic and a person with drinking problems and other types of character and judgment issues, should be nowhere close to advising the president on nuclear issues. You got 12 nuclear aircraft carriers, 30 plus nuclear submarines. This person clearly is not qualified to be in the Situation Room and advise. But on the core fundamentals, against the minimum wage, while CEOs' pay is going up, that picture of all those CEOs is going to hurt the president in the long term. Cutting health care benefits for working and middle-class families to pay for a tax cut for the wealthy, and making sure that gas prices in the Midwest jump. Remember, you got Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania in the Midwest. That is where a lot of oil and gas from Canada comes to the United States. You're going to see it at the pump with Donald Trump's tariff war.
Yeah, we'll see the vote.
That's where I would go.
We'll see the vote for Pete Hegseth later tonight. We should note he, of course, has denied the allegation that he is an alcoholic. He says he would stop drinking if confirmed. Mr. Ambassador,
the one thing here, I don't agree with Donald Trump. I admire the fact that he has never had a drink in that area. But once you have a drinking problem, you always have a drinking problem. And that job is not stress-free. I have been in this situation. You are 2 seats, the Secretary of Defense, down from the President of the United States. You have 1 million plus men and women under your command. That person should be nowhere close to advising the president, given what he has shown when he was just running a small veterans operation. He couldn't handle the stress. You know what the stress of a Secretary of Defense is in the Situation Room? Live or die, boots on the ground or not? Nowhere. And every senator knows it.
Yeah, and the 2 Republican senators Yeah, Mr. Ambassador, you're right. The 2 Republican senators who voiced opposition to his nomination both did cite character issues as part of why they couldn't support him. You were, of course, ambassador to Japan until just very recently. Let's turn let's turn to that part of the world right now, because we know President Trump has threatened tariffs against China in recent, coming up in a few days. At the same time, he's talked to Xi Jinping. He wants to have a visit to China soon. It has been reported. There's also been, what is your level of concern about some of the Democratic rollback we've seen in that area? And do you think that Trump foreign policy will be robust enough to the area that former President Biden said that relationship, U.S. and China, is by far the most important of the next century?
Well, I have a fundamental principle about the Indo-Pacific. It is a home game for China. It's an away game for the United States. And I hate using sports metaphors on big national security issues, but to understand this. And our allies, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, India, Australia, New Zealand, they level the playing field for the United States. You can't be a credible deterrent force from Long Beach, California in the Indo-Pacific. And you can't fight your adversaries and fight your allies. You got to pick. I happen to think our allies are tremendous resources for the United States. One of the things that China hates most is when the United States, Japan, and Korea under President Biden aligned correctly. Philippines, Japan, the United States aligned correctly. Now, to their credit, I'll call it out. One of the first meetings Secretary of State Rubio called for was the Quad, which is India, Australia, Japan, and the United States, showing China our allies stand with us. The isolated party in the Indo-Pacific is China based on their actions. Economic coercion, wolf warrior. You sit there and all of a sudden level up with your adversary, your allies are going to have real questions about your staying power. And so we are stronger when China sees a united front. We are weaker when they see divisions with our own allies. And my concern with President Trump, it's not that he has affinity for autocrats stylistically. He actually sees the world like they do. He sees Russia. You want Ukraine? You want Eastern Europe? That's your area of sphere of influence. China, Indo-Pacific. He sees that with this whole move on Greenland and Panama, that these are spheres of influence. He has a strategic alignment with them. That is fundamentally against America's interest. We have allies which are a multiplier of force and deterrence and the credibility of our deterrence. And my concern is not what everybody else in Washington writes, which is this idea, he has stylistic affinity. No, he is strategically aligned with them. And his comments about Xi, his comments about Putin as friends, his actually running down our allies weakens the credibility of America's deterrence. You want to stop wars, as he says, and I take his word seriously, you do it with allies aligned with you. And they're ready to be aligned with America's leadership.
Ambassador, good morning. Let's talk a little domestic politics. As you know, many progressives, many Democrats are dejected about what happened in the election. They fully expected that they would move forward with a President Kamala Harris, but now we're 4 more years of Donald Trump. He won all the swing states, some of them by very narrow margins. You've been at the center of Democratic politics for so long now as a congressman, as a chief of staff inside the Oval Office. What is your message to Democrats about not just how to handle Donald Trump, but how to get back on the horse and look ahead to the midterms, which really get underway about a year from now in terms of campaigning?
Well, there's a long thing to unpack, so I'm not sure we're going to be able to do it just here. But I would say, one, you focus on Donald Trump, that's opportunities to kind of create a narrative. But two, focus on the American people, not just Donald Trump. And I think that one of the mistakes for the party was that they became brain dead over the years, because 20 years ago, there was demographics is destiny. Don't worry, the demographics are going to work for the Democratic Party. And intellectually, policy-wise, we became brain dead. And I think the mistake to make is all we're going to do is focus on Donald Trump, which is where he wants you to focus, and not focus on the American people. That's number one.
Oh, that's right.
Number two, your recruitment is going to be very important. The profile, the story of the candidates, like we did in 06, like in 08, like 2018, their backgrounds in targeted districts have to tell the story of that district, not what the National Democrats want. And third and foremost, look, we're going to have, when we talk about kitchen table issues, we got to stop thinking that they're just economic, although those are important. They're also about schools, about public safety, about what's going on in the neighborhood. We had 2 Democrats get elected president and reelected since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. President Clinton and President Obama. President Clinton ran on 100,000 community police officers. We became identified with defund the police. One of those worked both policy-wise and politically. President Obama was criticized for being the deporter-in-chief. And then there were a lot of other Democrats who talked about free health care at the border if you cross the border illegally. One of those have worked politically and be the right policy. We have to be where the American people are at their kitchen table, not where we want them to be, but where they are, and talk to them. And the fact is, on a whole slew of issues, just take President Clinton's election in '92. For 20 years, there was a campaign against law and order by Richard Nixon, welfare queens by Ronald Reagan, Willie Horton by George Bush. It was Bill Clinton's message on a slew of issues, from crime to immigration to welfare reform to drug policy, that got right with the American people so they could hear the rest of what we're talking about. we can't ignore a set of issues because it makes us uncomfortable, that makes the American people uncomfortable. If they get right on how they live their lives, how they want to raise their kids, how they want to see what goes on in their communities and in their cities, then we're going to be okay. And I'll give you a classic example. I think this idea on what President Trump is talking about, raiding schools and places of worship on immigration, is as stupid as the Democrats closing schools and places of worship during COVID. And they are going to make a massive mistake of going after immigrants in schools, hospitals, and places of worship. And that's where Democrats can stand up and say, look, what, you got a criminal background? Out of here. Schools, hospitals, places of worship. That's as crazy as what we did during COVID. And we advocated. And it was very clear within 6 months that it was a wrong policy as it relates to public health and achieving educational goals. Here is there are places to stand and also understand what happens and how people live their lives. Not how we want them to live their lives, but how they actually live their lives, and that we're in touch with it from a values system. They can then hear everything else we have to talk about.
Former
now,
US
can I weigh in on?
Oh yeah.
Can I weigh in on one other subject?
Yeah, go ahead.
On the MVP.
Yeah,
on the MVP, it's between Lamar and Josh. Down to those two. That's where it is. I know I think every guest here forward should be asked these fundamental questions.
Well,
That's my two choices.
Like
and I have some other choices on the movie.
All right. And we'll have you weigh in on Blake Lively when you come back next. Former U.S.
No,
ambassador
I might leave that to another family member.
Rahm, wrong one. Rahm Emanuel, thank you very much.